The oldest and strongest emotion of mankind is fear, and the oldest and strongest kind of fear is fear of the unknown. Good evening, friends, and welcome back to Storytime for Adults. Stories normally post the fourth Monday of the month, but this evening's a bit off the normal calendar. So it's Halloween, or All Hallows Eve, or Samhain, if you wish to go all the way back to the Gaelic. And of course tomorrow and the following day, November's 1st and 2nd, will mark Dia de los Muertos, the Day of the Dead. Samhain, interestingly, is both the name of the festival in Gaelic as well as the name for the month of November. So, being Halloween, let's read a couple of spooky stories, shall we? So who are we reading? Well, I think we'll read stories from two different gentlemen this evening, the second of whom was very heavily influenced by the first. And I should note, I've actually read both of these authors before in the past. An American writer, poet, literary critic, and one of America's first practitioners of the short story, Edgar Allan Poe is without a doubt one of America's best-known authors whose works are inextricably linked to the macabre. And for our second author, an American writer and editor of weird and genre fiction, who's single-handedly responsible for creating an entire new genre of horror fiction, and whose influence on science fiction and horror are immense even today. H.P. Lovecraft casts a long shadow, and yet died almost unknown and in poverty. So these two authors have many similarities, but a number of important differences as well. And since this is a bonus episode, let's do things a little differently and do some compare and contrast, shall we? Both men were published during their own lifetimes, and yet largely unrecognized for their literary accomplishments, and often found it very difficult to live off the proceeds of their writing. Both men worked as editors and critics in literary journals. Both men died in poverty and relative obscurity outside of their circles in middle age, Poe at 40, Lovecraft at 46. The writings of both men initially became much more popular in Europe before catching on in their home country. In both cases, it was France and the French that deserve the credit for recognizing the greatness of their works en masse. Both men can be said to have founded a literary genre entirely on their own. Edgar Allan Poe is widely credited with writing the first modern detective story, Murder in the Rue Morgue, in 1841, anticipating Sherlock Holmes' first appearance in print by 46 years. H.P. Lovecraft founded the literary genre of cosmicism, or cosmic horror, oftentimes called Lovecraftian horror, himself, and changed the literary genre of speculative fiction, science fiction, and horror forever after. Both men have a major literary award strongly associated with them. The Mystery Writers Guild of America still gives the annual Edgar Awards for distinguished works in the mystery genre. The World Fantasy Awards between 1975 and 2015 gave out a bust of Lovecraft as their highest prize. In fact, the very first World Fantasy Awards were held in 1975 in Providence, Rhode Island, Lovecraft's hometown. Both men were prolific and expert practitioners of the short story, with Edgar Allan Poe being one of America's first practitioners of the form. When writing criticism of the works of other writers, both men were known to practice both insightful and often devastating criticism. In Poe's case, one of his most famous popular targets was the American poet Henry Wadsworth Longfellow. Both men lost their fathers at a very early age and grew up with separate paternal figures in their lives. There were, of course, many differences between them as well. While H.P. Lovecraft was an avowed atheist from the tender age of 8, Edgar Allan Poe was religious after a fashion. He's reported to have been a Christian of some sort, but his writings reveal a view of the world hovering somewhere between deism and pantheism. Of course, Lovecraft's own atheism is itself extremely notable given the times that he lived, 1890 to 1937. Edgar Allan Poe was notorious for his drug abuse and especially alcoholism, and that may well have played a significant role in his premature death. Lovecraft, meanwhile, was a lifelong teetotaler and generally looked down on those who drank. Edgar Allan Poe was something of a womanizer, was thrice married, had multiple children out of wedlock. H.P. Lovecraft never had any children, was married just once, and only lived with his wife for 4 years before separating, though they continued to warmly correspond with each other until his death in 1937. Edgar Allan Poe enlisted in the Army at the age of 18, eventually securing an appointment to West Point, then arranged to be court-martialed, having grown bored with the Army, while Lovecraft never undertook any sort of public or military service at all. Poe notoriously did not collaborate with other writers, while Lovecraft kept an extensive correspondence, especially with other writers, and famously collaborated with many authors, such as Robert E. Howard, Robert Bloch, Clark Ashton Smith, and August Derleth. Lovecraft encouraged other writers to borrow his themes, characters, and ideas, and in so doing formed the Lovecraft Circle, that would eventually give rise to the Cthulhu mythos, of which the short story The Call of Cthulhu is the most famous. So we've got a few more facts about both of these men, and then a brief foreword, and we'll start. Edgar Allan Poe was born January 9th, 1809, in Boston, to the actors David and Elizabeth Poe. He died October 7th, 1849, in Baltimore, Maryland, and even today the circumstances and causes of his death are mysterious. His medical records and death certificate have been lost, and the rumors of the causes of his death range from cerebral inflammation, that was a 19th century euphemism for alcoholism, to delirium tremens, heart disease, epilepsy, syphilis, cholera, meningeal inflammation, and rabies. There's even a rather complicated theory involving a form of electoral fraud called cooping. Howard Phillips Lovecraft was born August 29, 1890, in Providence, Rhode Island, to Winfield Scott and Sarah Susan Lovecraft. He died March 15, 1839, in Providence, from terminal cancer of the small intestine, having been diagnosed less than a month before his death, despite having had bouts of considerable abdominal pain for years beforehand. Lovecraft, you see, had an almost pathological fear of doctors. There's one more contrast that I wish to draw between these two men, or at least a point I wish to make about one of them, and that is that H.P. Lovecraft was a racist. Now, it's true that racism was a rather common attitude when he lived. Even amidst the environment, Lovecraft stood out for his distrust and fear of other races. In fairness, it would be reasonable to say that early in his life, Lovecraft seemed to hold almost everyone who wasn't from white, Anglo-Saxon, Protestant, upper-class stock in contempt. This very much included many people who were at the time considered white. By middle age in his marriage, Lovecraft's views seemed to have shifted significantly, and he expressed the view that assimilation was what was truly important. He appears to truly believe this as well. It's worth noting that in some of Lovecraft's correspondences, he expressed anti-Semitic attitudes very openly. However, his wife was Jewish, as was his friend and protege, Robert Bloch. In 1934, so Lovecraft and his aunt, with whom he was living at the time, spoke to a neighbor who'd recently returned from Germany, and they told him that he'd seen Jewish citizens being abused, and that the pogroms against the Jewish people were not just rumors made up by hysterical press. This conversation alone seems to have single-handedly changed his attitude towards Germany and the Nazi Party. Of course, Lovecraft never lived to see the Second World War or learn of the Holocaust, but I have a very hard time believing that he would not have been deeply affected by it. By the end of Lovecraft's life, his attitude towards race seemed to have shifted yet again, and again in the direction of slightly more acceptance, expressing the view that a real friend of civilization wishes merely to make the Germans more German, the French more French, the Spaniards more Spanish, and so on. And this does mark a notable shift since his early days and his barely concealed fear of miscegenation or race mixing. In fact, this idea of fear of racial pollution is a theme in much of the Cthulhu mythos. So that raises a pretty huge question, a pretty obvious and ugly one, really. Why should we be reading him at all? It's a fair question, and I think it's best been answered by the American science fiction fantasy author Elizabeth Bear. Because authors are read, beloved, and remembered not for what they don't do wrong, but for what they do right. And what Lovecraft does right is so incredibly effective. He's a master of mood, of sweeping blasted vistas of despair and the bone-soaking cold of space. He has at his command a worldview that the average human being, drunk on our own species-wide egocentrism, finds compelling for its sheer contrariness. Lovecraft gives us a universe that's not solipsistic at all, that has no regard or respect for human existence, a universe that regards us as much as we regard any creature incidental to our lives, dust mites maybe, or Antarctic tube worms. A universe whose reaction to the existence of the human race is, well, what's that got to do with me? This is probably an accurate assessment of our place in the universe, and Lovecraft manages to make us believe, for a little while, of the vast indifference of heaven. And it was this view that has been so incredibly influential. As Stephen King said, now that time has given us some perspective on his work, I think it is beyond doubt that H.P. Lovecraft has yet to be surpassed as the 20th century's greatest practitioner of the classic horror tale. Now, Lovecraft, as I said above, positively idolized Edgar Allan Poe and called him his god of fiction. Lovecraft also owed an openly stated debt to Lord Dunsany, but that's a story for another time. So tonight I have two tales for you, back to back. First, we'll be reading a story by Edgar Allan Poe, The Telltale Heart. And second, we'll be reading the H.P. Lovecraft short story, The Festival. So, The Telltale Heart by Edgar Allan Poe. True, nervous, very, very dreadfully nervous I'd been and am. And why will you say that I am mad? The disease had sharpened my senses, not destroyed, not dulled them. Above all was the sense of hearing acute. I made all things in the heaven and in the earth. I heard many things in hell. How, then, am I mad? Hearken and observe how healthily, how calmly I can tell you the whole story. It is impossible to say how first the idea entered my brain, but once conceived, it haunted me day and night. Object, there was none. Passion, there was none. I loved the old man. He'd never wronged me. He'd never given me insult. For his gold, I had no desire. I think it was his eye. Yes, it was this. One of his eyes resembled that of a vulture, a pale blue eye with a film over it. Whenever it fell upon me, my blood ran cold. And so, by degrees, very gradually, I made up my mind to take the life of the old man, and thus rid myself of the eye forever. Now, this is the point. You fancy me mad. Madmen know nothing. But you should have seen me. You should have seen how wisely I proceeded, with what caution, with what foresight, with what dissimulation I went to work. I was never kinder to the old man than during the whole week before I killed him. And every night, about midnight, I turned the latch on his door and opened it. Oh, so gently. And then, when I'd made an opening sufficient for my head, I put in a dark lantern, all closed so that no light shone out. And then I thrust in my head. Oh, you would have laughed to see how cunningly I thrust it in. I moved it slowly, very, very slowly, so that I might not disturb the old man's sleep. It took me an hour to place my whole head within the opening so far that I could see him as he lay upon his bed. Ha! Would a madman have been so wise as this? And then, when my head was well in the room, I undid the lantern cautiously. Oh, so cautiously. Cautiously, for the hinges creaked. I undid it just so much that a single thin ray fell upon the vulture eye. And this I did for 7 long nights, every night, just at midnight. But I found the eye always closed. And so it was impossible to do the work, for it was not the old man who vexed me, but his evil eye. And every morning, when the day broke, I went boldly into the chamber and spoke courageously to him, calling him by name in a hearty tone and inquiring how he'd passed the night. So, you see, he would have been a very profound old man indeed to suspect that every night, just at 12, I looked in upon him while he slept. Upon the 8th night, I was more than usually cautious in opening the door. A watch's minute hand moves more quickly than mine did. Never before that night had I felt the extent of my own powers, of my sagacity. I could scarcely contain my feelings of triumph, to think that there I was opening the door little by little, and he not even to dream of my secret deeds or thoughts. I fairly chuckled at the idea, and perhaps he heard me, for he moved on the bed suddenly, as if startled. Now, you may think that I drew back, but no. His room was as black as pitch, with the thick darkness, for the shutters were closed, fastened, through fear of robbers. And so I knew that he could not see the opening of the door, and I kept pushing it on steadily. I had my head in, and was about to open the lantern, when my thumb slipped upon the tin fastening, and the old man sprang up in the bed, crying out, "Who's there?" I kept quite still and said nothing. For a whole hour I did not move a muscle, and in the meantime I did not hear him lie down. He was still sitting up in the bed, listening, just as I have done, night after night, hearkening to the death watches in the wall. Presently, I heard a slight groan, and I knew it was the groan of mortal terror. It was not a groan of pain or of grief, oh no. It was the low, stifled sound that arises from the bottom of the soul when overcharged with awe. I knew the sound well. Many a night, just at midnight, when all the world slept, it has welled up from my own bosom, deepening with its dreadful echo the terrors that distracted me. I say I know it well. I knew what the old man felt and pitied him, although I chuckled at heart. I knew that he had been lying awake ever since the first slight noise when he'd turned into bed. His fears had been ever since growing upon him. He'd been trying to fancy them causeless, but could not. He'd been saying to himself, "It is nothing but the wind in the chimney. It is only a mouse across the floor," or "It is merely a cricket which has made a single chirp." Yes, he'd been trying to comfort himself with these suppositions. But he had found all in vain, because death, in approaching him, had stalked with his black shadow before him and enveloped the victim. And it was the mournful influence of the unperceived shadow that caused him to feel, although he neither saw nor heard, to feel the presence of my head within the room. When I'd waited a long time, very patiently, without hearing him lie down, I resolved to open a very, very little crevice in the lantern. So I opened it. You cannot imagine how stealthily, until at length a single dim ray, like the thread of the spider, shot from out the crevice and fell upon the vulture eye. It was open, wide open, and I grew furious as I gazed upon it. I saw it with perfect distinctness, all a dull blue, with a hideous veil over it that chilled the very marrow of my bones. But I could see nothing else in the old man's face or person, for I had directed the rays of my instinct precisely upon the damned spot. And now, have I not told you that what you mistake for madness is but over-acuteness of the senses? Now, I say, there came to my ears a low, dull, quick sound, such as a watch makes when enveloped in cotton. I knew that sound well, too. It was the beating of the old man's heart. It increased my fury, as the beating of a drum stimulates the soldier into courage. But even yet, I refrained and kept still. I scarcely breathed. I held the lantern motionless. I tried how steadily I could maintain the ray upon the eye. Meantime, the hellish tattoo of the heart increased. It grew quicker and quicker, and louder every instant. The old man's terror must have been extreme. It grew louder, I say louder every moment. Do you mark me well? I've told you that I am nervous. So I am. And now, at the dead hour of the night, amid the dreadful silence of that old house, so strange a noise as this excited me to uncontrolled terror. And for some minutes longer, I refrained and stood still. But the beating grew louder. I thought the heart must burst. And now a new anxiety seized me. The sound would be heard by a neighbor. The old man's hour had come. With a loud yell, I threw open the lantern and leapt into the room. He shrieked once, only once. In an instant, I dragged him to the floor and pulled the heavy bed over him. I then smiled gaily to find the deed so far done. But for many minutes, the heart beat on with a muffled sound. This, however, did not vex me. It would not be heard through the wall. At length, it ceased. The old man was dead. I removed the bed and examined the corpse. Yes, he was stone dead. I placed my hand upon the heart and held it there many minutes. There was no pulsation. He was stone dead. His eye would trouble me no more. If still you think me mad, you will think so no longer when I describe the wise precautions I took for the concealment of the body. The night waned, and I worked hastily but in silence. First of all, I dismembered the corpse. I cut off the head and the arms and the legs. I then took all 3 planks from the flooring of the chamber and deposited all between the scantlings. I then replaced the board so cleverly, so cunningly, that no human eye, not even his, could have detected anything wrong. There was nothing to wash out, no stain of any kind, no blood spot whatever. I had been too wary for that. A tub had caught all. When I'd made an end of these labors, it was 4 o'clock, still dark as midnight. As the bell sounded the hour, there came a knocking at the street door. I went down to open it with a light heart, for what had I now to fear? There entered 3 men, who introduced themselves with perfect suavity as officers of the police. A shriek had been heard by a neighbor during the night. Suspicions of foul play had been aroused. Information had been lodged at the police office, and they, the officers, had been deputed to search the premises. I smiled, for what had I to fear? I bade the gentleman welcome. The shriek, I said, was my own in a dream. The old man, I mentioned, was absent in the country. I took my visitors all over the house. I bade them search well. I led them at length to his chamber. I showed them his treasures, secure, undisturbed. In the enthusiasm of my confidence, I brought chairs into the room and desired them here to rest from their fatigues, while I myself, in the wild audacity of my perfect triumph, placed my own seat upon the very spot beneath which reposed the corpse of the victim. The officers were satisfied. My manner had convinced them. I was singularly at ease. They sat, and while I answered cheerily, they chatted of familiar things. But ere long, I felt myself getting pale, and wished them gone. My head ached, and I fancied a ringing in my ears. But still they sat and still chatted. The ringing became more distinct. It continued and became more distinct. I talked more freely to get rid of the feeling, but it continued and gained definitiveness until at length I found that the noise was not within my ears. No doubt, I now grew very pale. But I talked more fluently and with a heightened voice, yet the sound increased. And what could I do? It was a low, dull, quick sound. Much such a sound as a watch makes when enveloped in cotton. I gasped for breath, and yet the officers heard it not. I talked more quickly, more vehemently, but the noise steadily increased. I rose and argued about trifles in a high key and with violent gesticulations, but the noise steadily increased. Why would they not be gone? I paced the floor to and fro with heavy strides, as if excited to fury by the observations of the men, but the noise steadily increased. Oh God, what could I do? I foamed, I raved, I swore. I swung the chair upon which I had been sitting and grated it upon the boards, but the noise arose over all and continually increased. It grew louder, louder, and still the men chatted pleasantly and smiled. Was it possible they heard not? Almighty God, no. No, they heard, they suspected, they knew. They were making a mockery of my horror. This, I thought, and this I think. But anything was better than this agony. Anything was more tolerable than this derision. I could bear those hypocritical smiles no longer. I felt that I must scream or die. And now, again, hark, louder, 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 louder. Villains! I shrieked. Dissemble no more! I admit the deed! Tear up the planks! Here! It is the beating of his hideous heart! Edgar Allan Poe, January 1843. The Telltale Heart. So did I promise you all one more? Yeah. I'll be reading a story by Lovecraft titled The Festival. The festival was actually set during the season of Yule, but it seems like an appropriate Halloween story to me. Festival by H.P. Lovecraft. I was far from home, and the spell of the eastern sea was upon me. In the twilight I heard it pounding on the rocks, and I knew it lay just over the hill where the twisting willows writhed against the clearing sky and the first stars of evening. And because my fathers had called me to the old town beyond, I pushed on through the shallow, new-fallen snow, along the road that soared lonely up to where Aldebaran twinkled among the trees, on towards the very ancient town that I had never seen but often dreamed of. It was the Yule tide that men call Christmas, though they know in their hearts it is older than Bethlehem and Babylon, older than Memphis and mankind. It was the Yule tide, and I'd come at last to the ancient sea town where my people had dwelt and kept festival in the elder time when festival was forbidden. Where also they'd commanded their sons to keep festival once every century, that the memories of primal secrets might not be forgotten. Mine were an old people, and were old even when this land was settled 300 years before, and they were strange, because they had come in dark furtive folk from opiate southern gardens of orchids, and spoken another tongue before they learnt the tongue of the blue-eyed fishers. And now they were scattered, and shared only the rituals of mysteries that none living could understand. I was the only one who came back that night to the old fishing town as legend had, for only the poor and the lonely remember. Then beyond the hill's crest I saw Kingsport outspread frostily in the gloaming. Snowy Kingsport, with its ancient vanes and steeples, ridgepoles and chimney pots, wharves and small bridges, willow trees and graveyards, endless labyrinths of steep, narrow, crooked streets, and dizzy church-crowned central peaks that time durst not touch. Ceaseless mazes of colonial houses, piled and scattered at all angles and levels like a child's disordered blocks. Antiquity hovering on gray wings over winter-whitened gables and gambrel roofs, fanlights and small-paned windows, one by one, gleaming out in the cold dusk to join Orion and the archaic stars. And against the rotting wharves the sea pounded, the secretive, immemorial sea out of which the people had come in the elder time. Beside the road, at its crest, a still higher summit rose, bleak and windswept, and I saw it was a burying ground where black gravestones stuck ghoulishly through the snow like the decayed fingernails of a gigantic corpse. The printless road was very lonely, and sometimes I thought I heard a distant, horrible creaking as of a gibbet in the wind. They had hanged 4 kinsmen of mine for witchcraft in 1692, but I did not know just where. As the road wound down the seaward slope, I listened for the merry sounds of a village at evening, but did not hear them. Then I thought of the season, and felt that these old Puritan folk might well have Christmas customs strange to me, and full of silent hearthside prayer. So after that I did not listen for merriment, or look for wayfarers, but kept on, down past the hushed lighted farmhouses and shadowy stone walls to where the signs of ancient shops and sea taverns creaked in the salt breeze, and the grotesque knockers of pillared doorways glistened along deserted, unpaved lanes in the light of little curtained windows. I'd seen maps of the town and knew where to find the home of my people. I was told that I should be known and welcomed, for village legend lives along. So I hastened through back street to Circle Court and across the fresh snow on the one full flagstone pavement of the town to where Green Lane leads off behind the market house. The old map still held good, and I had no trouble, though at Arkham they must have lied when they said that the trolleys ran to this place, since I saw not a wire overhead. The snow would have hit the rails in any case. I was glad I had chosen to walk, for the white village had seemed very beautiful from the hill, and now I was eager to knock on the door of my people, the 7th house on the left in Green Lane, with an ancient peaked roof and jutting second story, all built before 1650. There were lights inside the house when I came upon it, and I saw from the diamond window panes that it must have been kept very close to its antique state. The upper part overhung the narrow, grass-grown street and nearly met the overhanging part of the house opposite, so that I was almost in a tunnel, with a low stone doorstep wholly free from snow. There was no sidewalk, but many houses had high doors reached by double flights of steps with iron railings. It was an odd scene, and because I was strange to New England, I had never known its like before. Though it pleased me, I would have relished it better if there had been footprints in the snow, and people in the streets, and a few windows without drawn curtains. When I sounded the archaic iron knocker, I was half afraid. Some fear had been gathering in me, perhaps because of the strangeness of my heritage and the bleakness of the evening, and the queerness of the silence of that aged town of curious customs. And when my knock was answered, I was fully afraid because I had not heard any footsteps before the door creaked open. But I was not afraid long, for the gowned, slippered old man in the doorway had a bland face that reassured me, and though he made signs that he was dumb, he wrote a quaint and ancient welcome with a stylus and a wax tablet that he carried. He beckoned me into a low, candlelit room with massive exposed rafters and dark, stiff, sparse furniture of the 17th century. The past was vivid there, for not an attribute was missing. There was a cavernous fireplace and a spinning wheel at which a bent old woman in loose slippers and deep poke bonnet sat back towards me, silently spinning despite the festive season. An indefinite dampness seemed upon the place, and I marveled that no fire should be blazing. The high-backed settle faced the row of curtained windows at the left, and seemed to be occupied, though I was not sure. I did not like everything about what I saw, and felt again the fear I had had. This fear grew stronger from what had before lessened it. For the more I looked at the old man's bland face, the more its very blandness terrified me. The eyes never moved, and the skin was too like wax. Finally, I was sure it was not a face at all, but a fiendishly cunning mask. But the flabby hands, curiously gloved, wrote genially on the tablet and told me that I must wait a while before I could be led to the place of festival. Pointing to a chair, table, and pile of books, the old man now left the room, and when I sat down to read, I saw that the books were hoary and moldy, and that they included old Morster's wild Marvels of Science, the terrible Seducimus Triumphatus of Joseph Glanville, published in 1681, the shocking Damonolatria of Remigius, printed in 1595 at Lyon, and worst of all, the unmentionable Necronomicon of the mad Abdul al-Hazri, and Olaus Wormius's forbidden Latin translation. A book which I had never seen, but of which I had heard monstrous things whispered. No one spoke to me, but I could hear the creaking of signs in the wind outside, and the whir of the wheel as the bonneted old woman continued her silent spinning. I thought the room, the books, and the people very morbid and disquieting, but because an old tradition of my father's had summoned me to strange feastings, I resolved to expect queer things. So I tried to read, and soon became tremblingly absorbed by something I found in the accursed Necronomicon. A thought and a legend too hideous for sanity or consciousness, but I disliked it when I fancied I heard the closing of one of the windows that the settle faced, as if it had been stealthily opened. It had seemed to follow a whirring that was not of the old woman's spinning wheel. This was not much, though, for the old woman was spinning very hard, and the aged clock had been striking. After that, I lost the feeling that there were persons on the settle. I was reading intently and shudderingly when the old man came back, booted and dressed in a loose antique costume, and sat down on that very bench so that I could not see him. It was certainly nervous waiting, and the blasphemous book in my hands made it doubly so. When 11 struck, however, the old man stood up, glided to a massive carved chest in a corner, and got 2 hooded cloaks, one of which he donned and the other of which he draped around the old woman, who was ceasing her monotonous spinning. Then they both started for the outer door, the woman lamely creeping, and the old man, after picking up the very book I had been reading, beckoning me as he drew his hood over that unmoving face or mask. We went out into the moonless and tortuous network of that incredibly ancient town. Went out as the lights in the curtained windows disappeared one by one, and the dog star leered at the throng of cowled, cloaked figures that poured silently from every doorway, and formed monstrous processions up this street and that, past the creaking signs and antediluvian gables, the thatched roofs and diamond-paned windows, threading precipitous lanes where decaying houses overlapped and crumbled together, gliding across open courts and churchyards, where the bobbing lanterns made eldritch, drunken constellations. Amid these hushed throngs, I followed my voiceless guides, jostled by elbows that seemed preternaturally soft, and pressed by chests and stomachs that seemed abnormally pulpy. But seeing never a face and hearing never a word, up, 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 the eerie columns slithered, and I saw that all the travelers were converging as they flowed near a sort of focus of crazy alleys at the top of a high hill in the center of the town, where perched a great white church. I had seen it from the road's crest when I looked at Kingsport in the new dusk, and it had made me shiver because Aldebaran had seemed to balance itself a moment on the ghostly spire. There was an open space around the church, partly a churchyard with spectral shafts, and partly a half-paved square swept neatly bare of snow by the wind and lined with unwholesomely archaic houses having peaked roofs and overhanging gables. Death fires danced over the tombs, revealing gruesome vistas, though queerly failing to cast any shadows. Past the churchyard, where there were no houses, I could see over the hill's summit and watch the glimmer of stars on the harbor, though the town was invisible and dark. Only once in a while, a lantern bobbed horribly through serpentine alleys on its way to overtake the throng that was now slipping speechlessly into the church. I waited till the crowd had oozed into the black doorway, until all the stragglers had followed. The old man was pulling at my sleeve, and I was determined to be the last. Then I finally went, the sinister man and the old spinning woman before me, crossing the threshold into that swarming temple of unknown darkness. I turned once to look at the outside world as the churchyard phosphorescence cast a sickly glow on the hilltop pavement. And as I did so, I shuddered. Though the wind had not left much snow, a few patches did remain on the path near the door, and in that fleeting backward look, it seemed to my troubled eyes that they bore no mark of passing feet, not even mine. The church was scarce lighted by all the lanterns that had entered it, for most of the throng had already vanished. They'd streamed up the aisle between the high white pews to the trap door of the vaults, which yawned loathsomely open just before the pulpit, and were now squirming noiselessly in. I followed dumbly down the foot-worn steps and into the dank, suffocating crypt. The tail of that sinuous line of night marchers seemed very horrible, and as I saw them wriggling into a venerable tomb, they seemed more horrible still. Then I noticed that the tomb's floor had an aperture down which the throng was sliding, and in a moment we were all descending an ominous staircase of rough-hewn stone, a narrow spiral staircase, damp and peculiarly odorous, that wound endlessly down into the bowels of the hill, past monotonous walls of dripping stone blocks and crumbling mortar. It was a silent, shocking descent, and I observed after a horrible interval that the walls and steps were changing in nature, as if chiseled out of the solid rock. What mainly troubled me was that the myriad footfalls made no sound and set up no echoes. After more eons of descent, I saw some side passages or burrows leading from unknown recesses of blackness to the shaft of nighted mystery. Soon they became excessively numerous, like impious catacombs of nameless menace, and their pungent odor of decay grew quite unbearable. I knew we must have passed down through the mountain and beneath the earth, or Kingsport itself, and I shivered that a town should be so aged and maggoty with subterranean evil. Then I saw the lurid shimmering of pale light, and heard the insidious lapping of sunless waters. Again I shivered, for I did not like the things that the night had brought, and wished bitterly that no forefather had summoned me to this primal rite. As the steps in the passage grew broader, I heard another sound, the thin, whining mockery of a feeble flute, and suddenly there spread out before me the boundless vista of an inner world, a vast fungus shore, litten by a belching column of sick greenish flame, and washed by a wide oily river that flowed from abysses frightful and unsuspecting to join the blackest gulfs of immemorial ocean. Fainting and gasping, I looked at that unhallowed Erebus of Titan toadstools, leprous fire, and slimy water, and saw the cloaked throngs forming a semicircle around the blazing pillar. It was the Yule rite, older than man, and fated to survive him, the primal rite of that solstice and of spring's promise beyond the snows, the rite of fire and evergreen light and music, and in the Stygian grotto I saw them do the rite, and adore the sick pillar of flame, and throw into the water handfuls gouged out of the vicious vegetation which glittered green in a chlorotic gaze. I saw this, and I saw something amorphously squatted far away from the light, piping noisomely on a flute, and as the thing piped, I thought I heard noxious muffled flutterings in the fetid darkness, where I could not see. But what frightened me most was that flaming column spouting volcanically from depths profound and inconceivable, casting no shadows as healthy flame should, and coating the nitrous stone above with a nasty venomous verdigris. For in all that seething combustion no warmth lay, but only the clamminess of death and corruption. The man who'd brought me now squirming to a point directly beside the hideous flame, and made stiff ceremonial motions to the semicircle he faced. At certain stages of the ritual, he did groveling obeisance, especially when he held above his head that abhorrent Necronomicon that he'd taken with him, and I shared all the obeisances because I'd been summoned to the festival by the writings of my forefathers. Then the old man made a signal to the half-seen flute player in the darkness, which player thereupon changed its feeble drone to a scarce louder drone in another key, precipitating as it did so a horror unthinkable and unexpected. At this horror I sank nearly to the lichened earth, transfixed with a dread, not of this nor any world, but only of the mad spaces between the stars. out of the unimaginable blackness beyond the gangrenous glare of that cold flame, out of the Tartarian leagues through which that oily river rolled uncanny, unheard, and unsuspected, there flopped rhythmically a horde of tame, trained, hybrid winged things that no sound eye could ever wholly grasp, or sound brain ever wholly remember. They were not altogether crows, nor moles, nor buzzards, nor ants, nor vampire bats, nor decomposed human beings, but something I cannot and must not recall. They flopped limply along, half with their webbed feet and half with their membranous wings, and as they reached the throng of celebrants, the cowed figures seized and mounted them, and rode off one by one along the reaches of that unlighted river into pits and galleries of panic where poisoned springs fed frightful and undiscoverable cataracts. The old spinning woman had gone with the throng, and the old man remained only because I had refused when he motioned me to seize an animal and ride like the rest. I saw when I staggered to my feet that the amorphous flute player had rolled out of sight, but that two of the beasts were patiently standing by. As I hung back, the old man produced his stylus and tablet and wrote that he was the true deputy of my fathers, who'd founded the Yule worship in this ancient place, that it had been decreed that I should come back, and that the most secret mysteries were yet to be performed. He wrote this in a very ancient hand, and when I still hesitated, he pulled from his loose robe a seal ring and a watch, both with my family arms, to prove that he is what he said. But it was a hideous proof, because I knew, from old papers, that the watch had been buried with my great-great-great-great-grandfather in 1698. Presently the old man drew back his hood and pointed to the family resemblance in his face, but I only shuddered, because I was sure that the face was merely a devilish waxen mask. The flopping animals were now scratching restlessly at the lichens, and I saw that the old man was nearly as restless himself. When one of the things began to waddle and edge away, he turned quickly to stop it, so that the suddenness of his motion dislodged the waxen mask from what should have been his head, and then, because that nightmare's position barred me from the stone staircase down which we'd come, I flung myself into the oily underground river that bubbled somewhere in the caves of the sea, flung myself into that putrescent juice of earth's inner horrors, before the madness of my screams could bring down upon me all the charnel legions these pest gulfs might conceal. At the hospital, they told me that I had been found half frozen in Kingsport harbor at dawn, clinging to the drifting spar that accident sent to save me. They told me that I had taken the wrong fork of the hill road the night before, had fallen over the cliffs at Orange Point, a thing they deduced from my prints found in the snow. There was nothing I could say, because everything was wrong. Everything was wrong, with the broad window showing a sea of roofs in which only about 1 in 5 was ancient, and the sound of trolleys and motors in the streets below. They insisted that this was Kingsport, and I could not deny it. When I went delirious at hearing that the hospital stood near the old churchyard on Central Hill, they sent me to St. Mary's Hospital in Arkham, where I could have better care. I liked it there, for the doctors were broad-minded, and even lent me their influence in obtaining a carefully sheltered copy of Alhazred's objectionable Necronomicon from the library of Miskatonic University. They said something about a psychosis and agreed that I had better get any harassing obsessions off my mind. So I read again that hideous chapter, and shuddered doubly, because it was indeed not new to me. I had seen it before. Let footprints tell what they might, and where it was I had seen it were best forgotten. There was no one in waking hours who could remind me of it. My dreams are filled with terror, because of phrases I dare not quote. I dare quote only one paragraph, put into such English as I can make out from the awkward Low Latin. "The nethermost caverns," he wrote, "are not for the fathoming of eyes that see, for their marvels are strange and terrific. Cursed the ground where dead thoughts live new and oddly bodied, and evil the mind that is held by no head. Wisely did Ibn Sakabo say, that happy is the tomb where no wizard hath lain, and happy the town at night whose wizards are all ashes. For it is of old rumor that the soul of the devil Bot hastes not from his charnel clay, but fats, and instructs the very worms that gnaw, till out of corruption horrid new life springs, and the dull scavengers of earth wax crafty to vex it, and swell monstrous to plague it. Great holes secretly are digged where earth's pores ought to suffice, and things that have learnt to walk that ought to crawl. That was The Festival by H.P. Lovecraft. So, I hope you all are having a wonderful Halloween. In case any of you are curious, I have read both Edgar Allan Poe and H.P. Lovecraft before. I read them both last year. From Poe, I believe we read The Pit and the Pendulum and The Mask of the Red Death. And from H.P. Lovecraft, we read The Outsider and The Music of Eric Zahn. Those should both be down in the Storytime for Adults playlist below from October of last year. So I hope you enjoyed our stories. I hope you have a wonderful evening, and I hope to see you next time.